Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for appearing today. Have you made a submission to Labor's Combating Misinformation and Disinformation Bill?
No, Senator. As I mentioned to Senator Hughes earlier, we have been involved in discussions with the department, mainly around how, once the government policy is settled, how that would be implemented, and as the regulator, what we would be looking for in the law to help us to do our job.
So the implementation rather than advice on the policy?
That's correct.
Okay. What about interactions with the previous government? Because my understanding is that this was first introduced, or that the concept was misinformation and disinformation was introduced by the previous government, and they introduced a bill, I think.
Senator, they didn't introduce a bill.
They had an election commitment to introduce new laws to provide ACMA with stronger enforcement and information gathering powers to hold big tech companies to account for harmful disinformation and misinformation online. So I'm happy to table that.
That's the previous government said that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Minister.
I know that the Department of Home Affairs and Department of Health have also been involved in censoring people during the COVID response.
Senator, I think
with social media.
I think you're referring to some requests, and I may be wrong.
They're ad hoc. They're not
ad hoc requests from Home Affairs to digital platforms to take it down. And I understand that Home Affairs confirmed this week that they were no longer doing that.
No longer.
That's right.
But they did admit that they did it, and they regretted it, which was encouraging. So, what interaction with the previous government?
Senator, I'm just trying to find my notes. We provided a report. I will pass over to my colleague Cathy Bransford, who can take you through the details. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you, Chair. Senator, we provided a report to the former government in June of 2021. That report covered our views on the development of what was the first iteration of the voluntary code on mis and disinformation developed by the digital industry, and our broader views, including reflecting some research we'd done on the state of mis and disinformation in Australia at that time. That was the report where we recommended that consideration be given to providing us with a range of powers, reserve powers, as a backup should the voluntary arrangements that the government had asked the industry to put in place were not effective in doing what they were. The then government released that report in early 2022, and at that point in time, the then minister put out the release to which the minister has just referred.
Okay.
The misinformation bill isn't voluntary, so the former government didn't put a bill out that was not voluntary. I'm just trying to understand, because I think there could be some misunderstanding of what the voluntary code proposed by you, the voluntary code proposed by the platforms themselves versus the draft legislation that we've got now. They're three different things.
The timeline was that the voluntary code was put in place. We made recommendations to the government of the day to say that we thought there were improvements that could be made to the code, but on top of that we thought that, as Ms Rainford described, there should be backup powers for the ACMA to register a code or to make a standard, and the industry gathering powers and record-keeping rules that we have proposed, which are reflected in the exposure draft bill. So
the reserve powers, if you want to call them that, or the opportunity to put a standard in, as the current bill says, came from ACMA, the idea, the concept.
That was our proposal to government.
Thank you. What consideration have you given to Australia's right to political expression? And I don't know whether that's a question for you or for the Minister, preferably from Ms Lachlan.
I think it's been at the heart of all the discussions in this area. It's reflected in the voluntary code of practice. It was something that digital platforms were extremely concerned about, so it is reflected in there in terms of the right to freedom of speech and political expression. We think that is fundamental to what we're trying to achieve here, as well as dealing with misinformation and disinformation that may cause harm to Australians. And trying to get that balance is the challenge for the government and the bill.
Right. In my opinion, the number one factor in human progress, and especially the last 170 years, has been freedom of speech and freedom generally to innovate. It would be terrible if the government could say whatever it wants to say, including misinformation, and the opposition was shut down and other opponents were shut down, because they're going to be regulated by this. How will you determine if something is political expression and will be protected from censorship?
That's not a matter that, as I expressed earlier, we're not going to be focused on individual pieces of content. That will be a matter remain, as it is now, a matter for the digital platforms.
Okay. Do you accept that the act of the government removing information, if the reserve powers come in, whether for noble purposes or not, is an act of censorship?
Senator, I'm not in a position to give an opinion. It would be inappropriate for me to give an opinion on that.
Minister, do you accept that the act of the government removing information, whether for noble purposes or not, is an act of censorship?
Well, we have already got laws in terms of hate speech already, Senator Roberts. But as we've already discussed, the draft bill, as it is now, and I'm sure you know, this is an exposure draft that's been put out there to enable people to put their views forward, and there have been thousands of submissions that we've gone through, or the department's gone through earlier today. So the draft bill, as it currently is out there, provides a number of safeguards for freedom of expression and robust public debates, which is important to our democracy. And the draft bill also sets a high bar of serious harm for what it defines to be misinformation and disinformation, which may be spread at scale. This includes malicious disinformation. So what the government is seeking to do is to work through the submissions and the consultations that have been received so far, and we're working through that feedback that has been provided, and we'll bring a piece of legislation to Parliament as soon as we're in a position to do that.
How will you classify material that's been removed?
Senator, I don't think it's a process of classification. If I can answer in a slightly different way, I think what the bill, in trying to get greater transparency for what the digital platforms propose to do and indeed do, is to get to your point that people understand where, if content is deprioritised or if content is removed, that there is a clear understanding as to what the decisions the digital platforms have made in taking that action. And I think that's very unclear to many people under the current arrangements.
Senator Roberts, you'll need to wind up so I can share the call.
Okay. I'll come back to more questions later, but just on that point of deprioritisation, that seems strange to me, because are you meaning that deprioritisation limits the reach of a social media post as opposed to taking it down?
Yes.
On what basis is deprioritising a post justifiable, because it's either misinformation or it's not?
That's a matter for the digital platforms. That's one of the actions that they have in their suite.
You're leaving them with the right to do that, but you're wanting them to be more transparent about how they do it.
We want them to be more transparent even under the current code, the current voluntary code. We think they need to be more transparent, and we think that as a fallback there should be the capacity for the regulator to seek greater information and greater transparency out of the platforms.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.